I turned off my own water on my ranch. Then the HOA learned I owned the only water line. Why would someone shut off the water on their own ranch? And why would that decision become such a serious issue? How could owning the only water line change everything people thought they understood? If you enjoy stories where ordinary moments turn into unforgettable conflicts, subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss the next one. What would you do if someone challenged your rights over something you believed was completely yours? Now, let me take you back to the moment when what seemed like a simple decision became the beginning of a story nobody involved could have predicted. The fastest way to lose an argument is to assume you already own the truth. My name is Ethan Walker, and on the morning everything started, I was not looking for a fight. I was standing beside the old pump house on my ranch with a pipe wrench in one hand and a brand new brass shutoff valve in the other. The air smelled like fresh-cut hay, damp earth, and warm cedar from the fence posts baking beneath the Texas sun. A slow breeze turned the weathered windmill behind the barn with its familiar metallic creak, and somewhere across the pasture my cattle barely looked up from their breakfast. It should have been an ordinary maintenance day. The old valve feeding my private water line had survived decades of hard use, but the handle had become stiff enough that every turn felt like twisting rust instead of steel. I had delayed replacing it for months because ranch work always seemed to create another priority, but ignoring it any longer would have been asking for trouble. I reached down, wrapped my hand around the handle, and slowly closed the valve. The faint rush of water faded until nothing remained except the wind across the open grassland. I remember glancing at my watch and thinking the entire replacement would probably take less than 45 minutes if nothing unexpected happened. I laid my tools across a clean white towel on the tailgate of my dusty pickup, right beside a weatherproof document folder I carried almost everywhere. Years of owning land had taught me one lesson. That never failed. Paper lasts longer than arguments. I stepped into the shallow trench where the exposed pipe disappeared beneath the pump house foundation and began loosening the old fittings one careful turn at a time. Rust cracked loose like dry leaves. The brass threads finally started moving after years without being disturbed. That was when I heard tires rolling over the gravel driveway. I looked up and watched a silver SUV stop beside my truck. The driver's door swung open, and Melissa Harper climbed out wearing a blue blazer that looked more appropriate for a board meeting than a ranch. She did not wave. She did not ask what I was fixing. She looked straight at the open trench, then at the silent water line, and her expression hardened before either of us had spoken a single word. She marched toward me holding a thick blue HOA binder against her side, as if it answered every question before anyone asked one. "Did you just shut off the neighborhood's water?" she demanded. I climbed out of the trench, brushed the dirt from my gloves, and looked from her binder to the old valve lying half removed from the pipe. I had heard confident accusations before, but something about the certainty in her voice told me she believed this ranch belonged to the HOA almost as much as the subdivision across the fence. What she did not realize was that the pipe beneath our boots had a history far older than the neighborhood surrounding it. Melissa stopped a few feet from the trench and looked from the exposed pipe to the silent pump house, as though she had just caught me committing a crime in broad daylight. "You cannot simply shut off the neighborhood water whenever you feel like it," she said, tightening her grip on the thick blue binder. I wiped my hands on the white towel resting on my truck and answered as calmly as I could. "I am replacing an old shutoff valve on my ranch." She shook her head before I even finished speaking. "That line serves homes inside the association. The HOA is responsible for community utilities." I glanced toward the weathered windmill turning lazily above the pasture, then back at the brass valve waiting beside my tools. "Responsible is not the same thing as owning," I replied. She opened the binder with practiced confidence, flipping through color-coded tabs until she found a section she clearly knew by memory. She held the pages toward me, tapping them with one finger. "The association has rules covering shared infrastructure and maintenance. You cannot interrupt essential service without authorization." Her voice carried across the quiet ranch, and within moments I noticed movement near the neighboring properties beyond the fence line. A man walking his dog slowed to watch. Another neighbor stepped onto a porch across the road. People have a way of drifting toward conflict long before they understand it. I leaned against the tailgate and looked at the papers inside my weatherproof document folder without opening it. Years earlier, I had learned that producing documents too soon often made people defend assumptions even harder. "Did anyone tell you this water line belongs to the HOA?" I asked. Melissa answered without hesitation. "Everyone knows it does." That sentence lingered in the warm morning air longer than either of us expected. Everyone knows. It sounded less like evidence and more like tradition repeated often enough to become accepted as fact. I stepped back into the shallow trench and carefully loosened another section of the old valve. Rust flaked away onto the dry soil while the brass replacement caught bright flashes of sunlight beside my wrench. Behind me, I heard another vehicle stop along the gravel road. Then another. Conversations began in low voices. Someone quietly wondered how long the water would be off. Someone else suggested the HOA had probably already handled situations like this before. Melissa folded her arms, satisfied that the growing audience reinforced her position. She expected me to stop working and defend myself. Instead, I continued preparing the replacement because the old valve was nearly free from the pipe. Every careful turn reminded me why I had decided to replace it before it failed completely. I could feel dozens of eyes shifting between the open trench, the blue binder, and the silent confidence neither of us seemed willing to surrender. Melissa finally broke the silence. "If you refuse to restore service immediately, I will have no choice but to call the sheriff." I looked at the aging valve resting in my hand, then at the unopened weatherproof folder on my truck, and realized the morning had already become something far bigger than routine ranch maintenance. What none of the people gathering outside my fence understood was that two completely different maps of the same land were about to collide, and only one of them had ever been recorded at the county courthouse. The sound of another vehicle crunching across the gravel pulled even more attention toward my ranch, and within a few minutes the quiet morning had turned into something that felt less like routine maintenance and more like a public hearing without a judge. Melissa stood beside her silver sport utility vehicle with the blue HOA binder tucked beneath one arm, greeting every new arrival with the confidence of someone convinced the outcome had already been decided. I noticed neighbors gathering near the fence line, some folding their arms, others whispering while glancing back and forth between the open trench and the silent pump house. One older man asked whether the water would be back on before lunchtime. A young couple wondered aloud if the entire subdivision had lost pressure. Nobody asked who actually owned the line. They only asked when someone else would fix the inconvenience. I climbed back into the shallow trench and continued removing the last section of the old valve, careful not to damage the threads that had survived decades beneath the Texas soil. Every slow turn of the wrench echoed softly against the steel pipe, while flakes of rust dropped onto the dry dirt below. The worn valve finally came free, heavier than it looked, its surface scarred by years of mineral buildup and weather. I placed it gently beside the polished brass replacement waiting on the clean white towel across my truck's tailgate. The contrast between the two pieces of metal could not have been clearer. One represented years of quiet service. The other represented preparation for years still to come. Melissa watched every movement with growing frustration. "You still have time to reconnect everything before this gets worse," she said. I looked up at her and answered without raising my voice. "I'm already fixing it." She shook her head. "You are ignoring the authority of the association." I glanced toward the weatherproof folder resting beside my tools. The county survey, engineering drawings, well permit, and property deed remained exactly where I had left them. They had not changed because someone believed something different. Neither had the pipe running beneath our feet. A breeze carried the scent of fresh-cut grass across the pasture as the windmill turned slowly above the barn, completely unaware of the argument unfolding below. One neighbor stepped closer and asked Melissa whether the HOA maintained this section of water line. "Of course," she replied immediately. "It serves the neighborhood." I noticed she answered the question about maintenance without answering the question about ownership. Those were two very different things, even if nobody else seemed to recognize the difference yet. The crowd continued growing, and with every new face the assumptions became stronger. People nodded as though repeating the same belief somehow transformed it into documented fact. I tightened the new brass valve into position by hand, making certain every thread seated perfectly before reaching for the wrench. Behind me, I heard Melissa pull out her phone. She looked directly at me before pressing the screen. "The sheriff can explain this better than I can," she announced confidently. Several neighbors exchanged relieved smiles, convinced official authority would settle the matter within minutes. I lowered myself beside the pipe once more and continued tightening the new valve with slow, steady pressure because I knew the sheriff would eventually ask the only question that had not yet crossed anyone else's mind. And when that moment arrived, the answer would not be found inside a blue binder. The sheriff arrived without lights or sirens, just the steady rumble of a county patrol truck rolling across the gravel until it stopped beside the growing line of parked vehicles. Dust drifted through the warm Texas air before slowly settling over the pasture, and for the first time since Melissa had arrived, the quiet conversations around the fence came to an abrupt stop. Deputy Sheriff Daniel Brooks stepped out, adjusted his hat against the sunlight, and took one slow look across the scene before saying a single word. His eyes moved from the open trench to the exposed pipe, then to my pickup truck with the polished brass valve, the old rusted valve, the neatly arranged tools, and the unopened weatherproof document folder resting beside them. Finally, he looked toward Melissa, who stepped forward immediately with the confidence of someone expecting a quick resolution. "Sheriff, thank you for coming," she began. "This ranch owner shut off the neighborhood water without authorization, and he refuses to restore service. The Homeowners Association needs your assistance." The sheriff listened without interrupting, his expression unchanged. When she finished, he simply nodded once before turning toward me. "Sir, what is being repaired today?" he asked in a calm voice. "An old shutoff valve on my private water line," I answered. "It was failing, so I shut the water off to replace it before it became an emergency." He looked down into the trench, noticing the freshly installed brass valve that was nearly tightened into place. He crouched for a moment, studying the exposed pipe before standing again. "How much longer?" he asked. "About 20 minutes, I replied. Melissa stepped forward before he could ask another question. "That is not the point," she insisted. "The association oversees this water system." The sheriff looked at her politely. "Oversees it or owns it?" The question seemed to catch her by surprise. She lifted the blue binder and opened it quickly, flipping through familiar tabs until she found several highlighted pages. "The HOA has maintenance responsibilities for community infrastructure," she answered while pointing at printed rules. The sheriff accepted the binder, read quietly for several seconds, then handed it back without comment. "I understand the maintenance policy," he said. "Now I need to determine ownership." Melissa hesitated for the first time since arriving. Around us, the neighbors remained completely silent. Even the people who had confidently nodded along with her earlier now watched the conversation more carefully. The sheriff turned back toward me. "Do you have documentation showing ownership of this line?" he asked. Without saying another word, I reached across the tailgate and unzipped the weatherproof document folder. Inside were carefully organized copies of my property deed, the county survey, engineering drawings for the original water installation, well permits, inspection reports, and recorded easement documents. I placed the stack neatly across the tailgate beside the old valve and the new brass replacement. The sheriff removed his sunglasses, picked up the county survey first, and began reading with patient attention while the afternoon breeze gently lifted the corners of the pages. Melissa watched him with growing uncertainty, still holding the blue binder against her side, unaware that every answer he was searching for had been recorded years before either of us had ever stood beside that trench. Deputy Sheriff Daniel Brooks laid the county survey flat across the tailgate and held one corner in place with the old rusted valve while the afternoon breeze tried to lift the edges. His eyes followed the boundary line slowly from the county road to my fence, then across the pasture until they reached the small square marking the well house. Without saying anything, he picked up the engineering drawing next, comparing the pipe route with the survey one careful section at a time. Nobody around us spoke. Even the neighbors who had arrived expecting a quick argument now watched the pages instead of the people. After several quiet minutes, the sheriff looked up at Melissa. "Do you have any recorded document showing the Homeowners Association owns this water line?" Melissa immediately opened her blue binder again, turning pages faster than before. She found maintenance schedules, landscaping rules, architectural guidelines, meeting minutes, and utility responsibilities, placing each page in front of the sheriff as though the next one would finally answer his question. He reviewed them politely before sliding each page back toward her. "These explain responsibilities," he said calmly. I am asking about ownership. Melissa frowned and flipped through another section marked infrastructure. The association has always maintained this system, she answered. Everyone in the neighborhood knows that. The sheriff nodded slightly, but did not write anything in his notebook. Maintenance and ownership are not automatically the same thing, he replied. A person or organization can maintain property they do not legally own. I need documentation establishing ownership or a recorded easement giving the association authority over this specific line. I remained beside the trench without interrupting. The polished brass valve sat fully seated in the pipe now, waiting only for the final tightening before I could restore water. My wrench rested beside the weatherproof folder, exactly where I had left it. The neighbors exchanged uncertain glances. For the first time all morning, the conversation shifted away from assumptions and toward documents. One older neighbor quietly asked another whether anyone had actually seen the original subdivision plans. Nobody answered. The sheriff turned another page in my survey and matched the parcel number against the property deed. Then he examined the recorded well permit, tracing the permit number with one finger before comparing it with the engineering drawing. Every document pointed to the same location, the same well, and the same private line running beneath the ground where we stood. He looked back toward Melissa once more. Does the association have a recorded easement crossing Mr. Walker's property? She searched through the binder again, this time much more slowly. The confidence that had filled her voice earlier began giving way to hesitation. She removed several loose papers, checked the back pocket of the binder, then returned to the highlighted tabs she had already shown him. Finally, she looked up and admitted, I do not have one with me. The sheriff folded his notebook closed without making a single conclusion aloud. Instead, he carefully stacked my deed, county survey, engineering drawing, inspection records, and well permit back into a neat pile on the tailgate. Then he rested one hand lightly on the weatherproof folder and asked the simplest question anyone had spoken all morning. If the association does not have documentation proving ownership or an easement, what exactly makes everyone so certain this line belongs to them? The silence that followed carried farther across the ranch than any argument ever could. Deputy Sheriff Daniel Brooks looked down at the engineering drawing one more time before tracing the blue line that represented the buried water pipe with the tip of his pen. He followed it from the well house across my pasture, through the shutoff valve sitting beneath my boots, and toward the neighborhood beyond the fence. Then he unfolded the recorded easement documents and compared the legal descriptions line by line with the county survey. Every parcel number matched. Every boundary aligned. Every reference pointed back to the same conclusion without leaving room for interpretation. He raised his eyes toward me. Mr. Walker, according to these recorded documents, this well, this shutoff valve, and the entire water line up to the subdivision connection are located on your property. I nodded once. That is correct. The sheriff continued reading for another moment before looking toward Melissa. I do not see any recorded transfer of ownership, utility dedication, or easement granting the homeowners association control over this section of the line. Melissa stared at the survey as though another answer might suddenly appear between the printed boundary markers. That cannot be right, she said quietly. The association has handled maintenance requests for years. The sheriff answered without changing his calm tone. Handling maintenance does not establish ownership. Sometimes property owners allow organizations or contractors to perform work for convenience. That arrangement does not automatically transfer legal control. I could almost feel the mood around the ranch shifting. Earlier that morning, everyone had been watching me. Now every set of eyes focused on the documents spread across my pickup truck. One neighbor stepped closer and looked at the survey with genuine curiosity instead of suspicion. Another pointed toward the well house and whispered that it had always been inside my fence, but nobody had ever questioned why. The old rusted valve remained on the white towel beside the polished brass replacement, quietly reminding me why the entire situation had started. If I had ignored the failing equipment for another season, none of this truth would have surfaced. The sheriff carefully returned the deed, survey, engineering drawings, inspection reports, and easement records to the weatherproof folder before handing it back to me. Based on the documentation available today, he said clearly enough for everyone gathered to hear, Mr. Walker is performing maintenance on infrastructure located on his own property. I do not find any evidence that he has violated the law by replacing his privately owned shutoff valve. The words settled over the crowd more heavily than I expected. Melissa lowered the blue binder slightly, no longer holding it like a shield. For the first time since she had arrived, she looked past the rules inside the binder and toward the actual land surrounding us. The wind stirred across the pasture, turning the old windmill with its familiar metallic rhythm, while the afternoon sun reflected brightly from the new brass valve already secured in place. I picked up my wrench and gave the final connection one careful turn until it seated perfectly against the fitting. Then I wiped my hands clean, reached for the valve handle, and paused for just a second before restoring the flow of water. Somewhere beyond the fence, the underground line quietly filled once again, exactly as it had for years, except now everyone standing there finally understood something they had never bothered to verify. The water had always crossed my ranch because the line had always belonged there first. The first sound I heard after turning the new brass handle was a low rush of water moving through the pipe beneath the ground, followed by the familiar hum inside the well house as pressure returned exactly the way it was supposed to. I watched the pressure gauge climb steadily until the needle settled into its normal operating range, and only then did I allow myself a quiet breath of relief. The repair had taken less than an hour, just as I had planned before the morning had been interrupted. Around me, however, nothing else felt quite the same. The neighbors who had gathered expecting to witness an argument stood silently along the fence, looking less at me than at the county survey they had just watched the sheriff examine. Melissa Harper remained beside her silver sport utility vehicle with the blue HOA binder resting against her side instead of being held out in front of her. The certainty that had filled her voice earlier had been replaced by thoughtful silence. Deputy Sheriff Daniel Brooks slipped his notebook back into his pocket and adjusted his hat before speaking one final time. "The documentation is clear," he said calmly. "If questions about this infrastructure come up again, they should begin with the recorded property documents, not assumptions." Nobody argued with him. Nobody asked another question. The sheriff nodded politely toward both of us before walking back to his patrol truck. The engine started, gravel shifted beneath the tires, and within moments the truck disappeared down the county road, leaving only the quiet sounds of the ranch behind. I bent down beside the trench for one last inspection, running my hand carefully around each connection to confirm there were no leaks. The polished brass valve reflected the afternoon sunlight, while the old rusted valve rested on the white towel across my tailgate like a retired piece of history. I picked it up for a moment, feeling its unexpected weight in my hand. For years it had controlled the flow of water beneath this ranch, and somehow it had also become the reason an entire neighborhood finally discovered where that water actually came from. One of the older neighbors slowly walked toward me with an uncertain smile. "I guess we all assumed the line belonged to the subdivision," he admitted. I smiled politely. Most people never have a reason to check until something needs to be repaired. He nodded while looking toward the weatherproof folder that now held every document neatly stacked once again. "I think I might request a copy of my own survey when I get home," he said. Another neighbor quietly agreed, and before long several others began talking among themselves about deeds, easements, and property boundaries instead of HOA rules. Melissa looked toward me as though she wanted to say something, but she simply closed the blue binder and placed it inside her vehicle without another word. There was no celebration waiting for me, and I did not want one. I gathered my wrench, folded the white towel, returned the old valve to the truck bed, and zipped the weatherproof folder closed before setting it beside my toolbox. The wind continued turning the old ranch windmill exactly as it had all morning. The cattle continued grazing beyond the cedar fence, and fresh water continued flowing quietly beneath the pasture. The loudest part of the day had ended, yet the lesson it left behind felt stronger than any argument ever could. Ownership had never depended on who spoke with the greatest confidence. It had simply been waiting inside the documents all along, patient enough to let the truth speak for itself. Over the next several days, the ranch slowly settled back into its familiar rhythm. But the conversations that morning had clearly traveled much farther than the water flowing beneath my pasture. Every sunrise still painted the cedar fence with warm golden light. The old windmill still turned with its slow metallic creak, and my cattle still wandered across the same fields without the slightest concern for property lines or association meetings. Yet whenever I drove past the subdivision entrance, I noticed people looking toward the pump house with entirely different expressions than before. Curiosity had replaced certainty. One afternoon, while I was repairing a section of fence near the county road, the same older neighbor who had spoken with me after the sheriff left pulled into my driveway. This time he was carrying a rolled survey map instead of questions. He smiled as he climbed out of his truck. "I finally requested my property records," he said with a quiet laugh. "Turns out I have been guessing where my back property line was for almost 10 years. We spread his survey across the tailgate of my pickup beside my own weatherproof document folder, and within a few minutes we located every corner marker exactly where the county records said they should be. Before long, another neighbor stopped by with similar questions about an easement crossing the edge of his land. Then another wanted help understanding an old deed description that had been passed from one owner to the next without anyone reading it carefully. None of them came looking for an argument. They came looking for facts. That small change felt far more important than winning any disagreement ever could. A week later, I happened to see Melissa Harper during a community meeting held at the subdivision clubhouse. She was standing near the entrance speaking with several homeowners. But this time, there was no blue binder raised like a final answer to every discussion. When she noticed me walking past, she stepped over with a polite smile that looked far more genuine than confident. "Mr. Walker," she said, "I spent the last few days reviewing the county records." I nodded without interrupting. She glanced toward the ranch visible beyond the trees and took a slow breath. I should have verified the documents before assuming the association controlled that line. There was no dramatic apology and no attempt to excuse what had happened. It was simply an honest acknowledgement that assumptions had carried more weight than evidence. "County records exist for a reason," I replied. "They save everyone a lot of unnecessary trouble." She agreed with a quiet nod. Several homeowners standing nearby listened carefully, and instead of debating HOA authority, they began discussing ways to encourage every new resident to review property surveys and recorded easements during the home buying process. That conversation alone made the entire experience worthwhile. As I drove back toward my ranch that evening, the setting sun reflected across the freshly installed brass valve whenever I opened the pump house door for a routine inspection. Everything worked exactly as it should. Water flowed smoothly beneath the ground. The pressure gauge remained perfectly steady, and the weatherproof folder rested safely on the shelf where I always kept it after finishing a project. Looking around the quiet ranch, I realized the strongest changes had not happened underground inside the pipe. They had happened above the surface, where people finally stopped relying on assumptions and started trusting the documents that had been waiting there all along. Several weeks passed before I realized the ranch had returned completely to normal, not because anything dramatic had happened, but because nothing unusual happened anymore. Every morning, I unlocked the pump house, glanced at the pressure gauge, listened to the steady hum of the well, and watched the polished brass shutoff valve perform its job without complaint. The old rusted valve never went into a trash bin. Instead, I cleaned the dirt from its surface and placed it on a wooden shelf inside my workshop beside a framed copy of the county survey and the weatherproof document folder that had quietly ended an argument no amount of shouting could have settled. Whenever I looked at that worn piece of steel, I no longer saw a broken valve. I saw the morning an entire neighborhood discovered the difference between believing something and proving it. Life around the subdivision changed in small but meaningful ways after that day. New homeowners began requesting copies of their property surveys before making improvements to their land. Conversations during community meetings slowly shifted away from assumptions and toward county records, easements, and deeds. The Homeowners Association even introduced a simple recommendation encouraging residents to verify official property documents before making decisions involving neighboring land. Nobody mentioned my name during those discussions, and that suited me just fine. The lesson had never been about me. It had always been about respecting facts before forming conclusions. One afternoon, I crossed paths with Deputy Sheriff Daniel Brooks at a local feed store. He smiled as we loaded supplies into our trucks and asked how the new valve was holding up. I told him it was working exactly as expected. He laughed quietly and said, "Sometimes the quietest repairs solve the loudest disagreements." That sentence stayed with me all the way home. Months later, Melissa Harper drove past the ranch while I was repairing a section of fence near the road. She slowed long enough to wave, and I returned the gesture before both of us continued with our day. There was no lingering bitterness because there was nothing left to prove. The documents had already spoken more clearly than either of us ever could. As the seasons changed, the grass grew taller across the pasture, the cattle continued grazing beneath the same wide Texas sky, and the old windmill never stopped turning above the well house. The polished brass valve remained hidden beneath the ground where nobody noticed it anymore, quietly doing the job it had been installed to do. That seemed fitting because the strongest truths rarely demand attention. They simply continue working whether anyone is watching or not. Looking back now, I understand that shutting off the water for less than an hour was never the real story. The real story was what surfaced after the water stopped flowing. Assumptions faded. Records mattered. Confidence gave way to evidence. A blue binder filled with policies could explain responsibilities, but it could never rewrite a recorded deed. A calm conversation supported by verified documents accomplished more than raised voices ever could. That old valve still sits on my workshop shelf today, not as a trophy, but as a reminder that patience, preparation, and proof will always outlast certainty built on assumptions. Around here, ownership never needed permission, approval, or the loudest opinion in the crowd. It only needed the truth, recorded long before anyone thought to question it, quietly waiting for the day someone finally decided to read it.